A Russian unit just snapped. Near Chasiv Yar, soldiers gunned down their own platoon commander, then surrendered en masse to Ukraine. This wasn't an isolated breakdown. It's the latest and clearest sign that the Russian military is cracking under pressure. Discipline is unraveling, morale is collapsing, and Russia's war machine is turning on itself. Let's break down what triggered this stunning mutiny, what it reveals about the state of Russia's forces, and how Ukraine could turn these fractures into major battlefield gains. First, the actual details of the event. According to Ukrainian Defense Ministry intelligence, the incident occurred when Russian troops refused orders to storm fortified Ukrainian positions without adequate artillery or armored support. They were basically ordered to take part in a suicide mission. When their commander threatened to execute soldiers who wouldn't advance, they turned their weapons on him instead. The details didn't come from Ukrainian troops though. This vital insight into the Russian military and the current state of its morale comes straight from the Russian troops themselves, who were there for the entire event. You see, once the troops killed their platoon commander, they didn't really have anywhere to go but Ukraine itself. Under Russian law, they would be detained and likely imprisoned by Russia's military police, which have reportedly caught wind of the mutiny and already begun searching for the deserters. Therefore, the soldiers immediately waved white flags of surrender while passing through the contested front line, where they were captured by Ukrainian troops who passed on this valuable information. The report from Ukrainian intelligence didn't state the exact names of the mutineers and the location of the incident, but the general location is believed to be Chasiv Yar, near the city of Bakhmut, which has been a hotly contested region even before Bakhmut fell to the attritional warfare conducted by Russian forces. The loss of a single platoon is unlikely to turn the tide for the Ukrainian units and allow them to retake the city of Bakhmut. Ukraine has listed the city as one of the major tactical targets throughout the war, despite a lack of actual strategic value it has in the grand scale of the war itself. But this mutiny and subsequent surrender are an excellent insight into Russia's ongoing failures to capture Ukraine and also drive its own military forward. Russia isn't just losing battles and people, it's losing the will to actually win the war in the first place, which can spell doom for the entire war effort. And this is interlaced with the country's gradual economic, demographic, and geopolitical decline over the course of the 3 years of the war. While Russian state media focuses on capturing villages Ukraine had already liberated months earlier, the real war is happening far behind the lines in the databases and supply lines that are responsible for delivering soldiers to the front in the first place. The recent mutiny is just one of the symptoms of a disease that has been plaguing Russia since practically the second year of the war: widespread manpower shortage. The numbers here paint a grim picture. When the war started, the Russian military was estimated to have around 900,000 active troops, with around 100,000 to 160,000 of them stationed around Ukraine and poised to attack. When the invasion happened and the initial attacks were rebuffed by Ukraine, Russia deployed another 190,000 soldiers to fight in the war, as well as raised its contracting options and benefits to lure in more people. 3 years later, those numbers have changed drastically. For one, the active military size is estimated to be around 1.1 million, with around 660,000 deployed in Ukraine. But instead of steadily growing in skill and experience, the Russian army has been replacing the soldiers it loses with ones that are not nearly as experienced or trained. According to estimates made by Ukraine's Ministry of Defense, Russia hit the 1 million casualty mark somewhere around June 2025, counting both dead and wounded soldiers who can't return to combat in a reasonable time. Of course, these are figures straight from a country that has every incentive to inflate the numbers for publicity and morale, so it's worth taking with a grain of salt. However, even more conservative US intelligence estimates put Russian casualties around 750,000 by March 2025. If we go by simple linear expansion, Russia will indeed eventually hit 1 million casualties by the end of the 4th year, according to US estimates alone. This is not just a setback, it's a practical disintegration of Russia's military integrity. The casualties here are higher than in every conflict Russia has been a part of since World War II. The staggering casualty rate directly leads to a pattern where Russia is forced to use more drastic measures to conscript or sign up soldiers to fight. With practically its entire pre-war troop reserves gone, most of the soldiers who are currently on the front can assume to be relatively fresh recruits. But here's where the maths becomes truly devastating. Russian forces have advanced an average of only 50 meters per day in areas like Kharkiv. When you scale that against Ukraine's entire territory, the advance is practically negligible. And the cost of that advance is more than just in men or equipment, it's straight up bankrupting the country. Russia is spending World War II level resources, with an estimated 40% of its federal budget on defense, on a war that has made it an outcast from most international agreements. The incident near Chasiv Yar involving the 20th Combined Arms Army also reflects a broader pattern of Russia losing the higher echelons of the army during the war before it can promote more. Russian sources have confirmed deaths of 12 generals, with Ukraine citing an additional 4. At the same time, Mediazona, an independent Russian news outlet, claims to have found that at least 5,138 Russian officers have been killed as of June 2025. This might not sound like much when compared to the gross casualty numbers, but it can put the entire war in jeopardy when you consider Russian military tactics. You see, unlike the West, Russian military doctrine is highly centralized. The generals and higher officers hold the most power and provide orders down the chain of command, where they are expected to be obeyed with practically no modifications and no regard to the actual state of the front line. This creates major issues for the Russian military that Ukraine has thoroughly abused throughout the war. First, it makes the military far less adaptive to changing situations than it should. Considering the extent of surveillance and drone warfare, Ukraine can get practically real-time information on Russian army movements and extrapolate the intended targets in short term. Then it can use the advanced drone squads to provide enough pressure or overturn a key aspect of the operation, so it becomes less viable for the Russian command. This has, at times, resulted in devastating Russian losses, where a vast majority of the troops died due to having no exit routes or plans for what to do if the situation took a sudden turn. Secondly, killing an officer creates a large gap in the chain of command that the Russian military doesn't have a ready way to close at the speeds necessary to make up for the potential tactical losses. This meant that Ukraine can directly target officers with precision strikes to create confusion in the ranks, at the same cost it would take to launch an attack on any other military installation. Even worse for Russia, Ukraine knows how crucial officers are and the extent of Russia's propaganda and disinformation campaigns that target both its citizens and soldiers. This has led to Ukraine becoming much more resilient to Russia's hybrid warfare strategy, devising methods to specifically counter Russian propaganda and provide accurate information to both its own and Russian troops. For example, Ukraine launched the I Want to Live campaign to target Russian soldiers behind the front lines, promising humane treatment of prisoners of war and even asylum options. This heavily contrasts with how Russia stifles any attempts to even avoid the draft by threatening harsh fines and jail time. More specifically, Ukraine has leveraged the fact that Russia is much less culturally cohesive than at first glance to target the most marginalized groups, which are coincidentally the ones most affected by Russian conscription, which we'll discuss a bit later. Finally, Russia's military doctrine, although centralized in its approach to the command chain, is actually highly fragmented in the implementation of training practices. According to the Center for Naval Analyses, each officer is responsible for training both conscripts and contract soldiers, but the extent of that training depends on the officer in question. With loose reporting requirements and overhead, the Russian military reportedly has significant issues with a lack of proper training, where officers misinform the central command on the extent of training their soldiers have for particular scenarios or situations. In some cases, the lack of training has led to Russian troops being deployed after only a week of training, and with no clear big picture or training for the missions they're expected to embark on in Ukraine. Considering the failure of Russia's military doctrine to actually prepare soldiers for an actual large-scale war, and it's fairly obvious the war in Ukraine reached that point years ago, it's no surprise that we're seeing troops surrender against incoming Ukrainian forces, and it's not the first time this has happened. In August 2024, Ukraine crossed the border and invaded Kursk with only 1,000 soldiers. The inexperienced Russian conscripts there similarly surrendered in waves, which led to one of the most successful Ukrainian missions to date. The Kursk incursion garnered widespread acclaim and gave Ukraine a political boost, helping Kyiv rally further international support. A key part of the problem? Russia has created a military that doesn't actually reflect the values of the core population of Russians in large cities. The official partial mobilization in 2022 primarily targeted areas away from Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other large cities. Thus, the burden of filling the ranks fell upon the poorer regions of Russia. And while Russia announced attempts at other mobilizations, they never seem to have materialized, at least officially. However, covert waves of mobilization seem to follow the same pattern, with the mobilization in Dagestan being the most recent example. These mobilizations specifically target members of ethnic minorities, of which there are many, solely due to the sheer size and population spread in the country. But this social policy is effectively draining Russia's own productive capacity. The major population centers house the most able-bodied men, sure, but they are also the highest concentrations of the middle economic class, who are likely not part of the military-industrial complex that is creating the same equipment that Russia is losing in Ukraine every day. So Russia is basically dipping into the same limited pool of people for both its industry and conscription, all the while spreading propaganda that victory is a foregone conclusion. And the reason that the propaganda has such a deep hold in Russia is precisely due to the unequal conscription efforts. If the large population centers don't experience demographic drain from men being sent to war or employed in the military-industrial complex, the Kremlin can maintain an illusion that Russia doesn't have nearly as many casualties as the West claims. The fact that the Kremlin is going to these lengths to further the propaganda directly implies the fragility of the system in place and why these mutinies can have a large effect on the outcome of the war. News of officers and generals being killed in Ukraine is much more difficult to explain away and can break the circle of propaganda that drives Moscow and other large cities. And as if the domestic recruitment crisis wasn't damaging enough, Russia's manpower shortage has forced it to import fighters from North Korea and Iran. This creates additional layers of dysfunction that further undermine military cohesion and drive down morale. An estimated 11,000 North Korean soldiers were deployed to the Kursk region in October 2024 to take part in the Russian counteroffensive, where they've suffered catastrophic losses. According to South Korean intelligence, approximately 300 North Korean soldiers were killed and almost 2,700 were wounded by January 2025. Western officials estimate as many as 6,000 total casualties, which is around half of the original deployment. The troops performed so poorly that Russia withdrew them from the region less than 6 months into the counteroffensive. And in March 2025, another 3,000 North Korean troops were reportedly being shipped to Russia to replace the casualties. In two disastrous friendly fire incidents, North Korean troops reportedly fired on both Russian and Chechen units, killing their allies and throwing parts of the offensive into disarray. And despite this, Russia didn't actually withdraw those forces from Kursk until months later. This alone suggests the extent of Russia's military manpower issues and the sheer disregard for the conscripts it has deployed to the region. But the North Korean casualty rate isn't the only problem. GoPro footage from May, shared by Iranian news outlets, shows Russian uniformed soldiers speaking Persian before an assault, revealing that Iranian fighters are also now on the battlefield. In the footage, Iranian and Russian soldiers struggle to communicate, with Russian soldiers repeatedly trying to tell the Iranians they need to move out, while one Iranian complains about a foot injury. The deployment of Iranian and other foreign fighters does help Russia sustain the manpower requirements of its constant assaults. However, the language barriers can severely hinder coordination and intelligence sharing, just as with the North Koreans, leading to disorganized attacks, higher casualties, and risks of friendly fire. It's created a military nightmare. Some units can't communicate effectively. Soldiers who don't understand orders and commanders trying to coordinate attacks using troops from 3 different countries with incompatible training doctrines. North Korean troops in particular fared the worst, as they feared repercussions from their own government, which has been known to imprison family members, resulting in soldiers committing suicidal charges into Ukrainian lines rather than surrender. Additionally, importing foreign troops is an incredibly limited solution. Going by the most recent estimates by Ukraine's military intelligence, Russia is losing over 1,100 soldiers per day. Thus, 10,000 troops represents a less than 10-day supply of soldiers who are fed to the meat grinder in an attempt to gain control of a few insignificant villages. Of course, not all of the troops there will die within those 10 days, as the losses are distributed across the 800-mile front line. However, the previous casualty numbers for North Korean forces suggest a 6-month attrition rate of 50%. When you look at it from a different angle, a soldier who's deployed for Russia has a 50-50 chance of surviving the next 6 months, essentially a coin toss. A large reason why Russia has accumulated such a staggering number of losses is simply due to the natural evolution of modern warfare, heavily favoring long-range and impersonal strategies. By 2025, roughly 70% of Russian equipment losses came from drone warfare alone. It's not that difficult a stretch to assume that manpower casualties follow the same pattern. Russian soldiers are being sent to the front line not to fight Ukrainian soldiers, but to evade constant drone surveillance and precision attacks. Russia appears to be trying to win through sheer resource attrition warfare. With an army that still outnumbers Ukraine's and the ability to import soldiers from North Korea, a country that has over 1.2 million active troop members, despite its relatively small size, Russia is literally attempting to throw people at the problem and hoping it solves itself. The consequences of this strategy also seep into Russia's economy. Russia is now offering salaries to conscripts and foreign soldiers that are several times higher than the national average. This is a significant drain on the rest of the economy that's already being pushed to the limits by an unsustainable 2.2% unemployment rate as of May 2025. In fact, raising the pay of soldiers and their families has cost Russia more than 8% of the government's budget, a figure unseen anywhere else in the world. At the same time, Russia is paying North Korea and Iran for equipment, ammunition, defense systems, or even military engineers. The slow but steady drain of Russia's economy is further exacerbated by the increasing stranglehold Western sanctions have on Russia's ability to gain income from its gas and oil trade, which has at times accounted for 40% of the government's income. Thus, Russia has created a deadly cycle. The more people Russia loses, the more it will need to spend to incentivize recruitment. Additionally, with every passing month, the risks and costs of operating a shadow fleet to transport oil and gas through international waters also increase. These added costs of maintaining a war are further cemented by the fact that Russia is losing the ability to trade with other countries or retain high-income personnel. more than 900,000 Russians left the country even before the second year of the war. Due to the prohibitive cost of tickets and lack of destination options, these were mainly middle-class families that represented significant earning potential in Russia, mainly in IT and related branches. Russia doesn't really have a way to recoup for this loss, as it's already busy trying to bolster its failing military. The incident at Chasiv Yar, with soldiers killing their commander before surrendering, illustrates Putin's impossible position. He can't win militarily using tactics that require casualties Russia can't afford. He can't negotiate from a position of strength when his own troops are turning their weapons on their officers. And he can't sustain the economic burden of a war that's consuming 40% of his federal budget for territorial gains measured in football fields. More fundamentally, Russia's class-based conscription strategy reveals Putin's inability to make the argument to his people that the war against Ukraine is existential rather than optional. By systematically shielding Moscow's elite and middle class from conscription while targeting the rural poor and ethnic minorities, Putin has essentially admitted that this war isn't worth the sacrifice of Russia's economically and politically important populations. The unequal conscription creates a positive feedback loop with negative results. Russia's poorest regions lose their working-age men to death or emigration, further impoverishing these areas and reducing their economic productivity. The families left behind sometimes even have to subsidize the war effort by buying military equipment for their conscripted relatives. Meanwhile, Russia's economically productive regions remain largely insulated from the war's costs, creating no political pressure for the conflict to end, but also no genuine economic mobilization for victory. And now, precious resources that could support domestic forces are instead spent on foreign mercenaries who can't even communicate with their supposed allies. If the war truly threatens Russia as a whole, Moscow wouldn't recruit soldiers who can't speak Russian and don't understand basic military protocols. It would call up a general draft and rely on having a population close to 4 times that of Ukraine to win, with every demographic mobilized equally. The fact that Russia is paying North Korea for troops while simultaneously providing expensive military technology transfers suggests that Russia is hoping that the rest of the country can pay for this loss out of pocket before the entire economic system implodes. And the more time passes, the more likely the latter scenario becomes. According to a Forbes analysis, Russia would need approximately 230 years to fully occupy Ukraine at the current rate of advance. This would require around 100 million Russian casualties, which is more than the number of adults it has at the moment. Unfortunately for Russia, it doesn't have 230 years. It doesn't have the demographic base for 100 million casualties. And as incidents like the commander's killing near Chasiv Yar demonstrate, it's rapidly losing the one thing no military can function without: the willingness of soldiers to obey orders from a system that views them as expendable. Thank you for watching. And if you want to find out how Ukraine has managed to turn the tide of the war through drone warfare, one of the main reasons for this widespread collapse, check out this video. To stay updated with the most recent developments in the war in Ukraine and other conflicts, subscribe.